the creatures you see here coexist, are related in space and time. All right, so we've kicked to the side our anapsid, amnio reptile group. We recognized that last time that was not the only anapsid that ever lived, but they're the only ones left. All the others, with the cross symbol went extinct, right? And now we're launching into, again, one of our oldest of lineages in the reptile group, but for which we have much more recent success in a taxonomic and natural history sense. Right? We're left with nearly 8,000 species from several major divisions within this group. And what I want you to think about them by and large as a lineage that is locomotorily much more successful, i.e. efficient, in how they move on this relatively new substrate, right, land. And I say that, of course, not in the sense of in the last few weeks, but in the last 200 million years, as opposed to the last 400 million years, right? And we're going to see them get away, in so doing, moving well, getting away from water, and being able to thrive in ways away from water, including now inhabiting trees, foraging in new ways, right? And in some ways being smaller, which goes along with the feeding and the locomotory adaptations. So those are kind of big principles that I want you to kind of glean from this moving forward. And my first slide, of course, launches us into our at least larger taxonomic divisions. Our Tuatara at the top here, which in many ways will look to you like a fairly common lizard, right? But it is different for a number of reasons, and we'll cover those. But they are our ancient representative not only of contemporary members of this group, but of historical members of this group. 200 plus million years ago, there were fossils of Tuatara relatives within their family and within their orders. Okay. So we'll introduce you to the one species that's left. 10 years ago, there were 2 species. In 2009, they updated their information with DNA evidence, and they are really indistinguishable, and now are one species with 2 subspecies. Right? And then we'll spend the rest of the time into what probably is much more familiar and exciting turf for you in the land, small-legged squamates, the lizards and relatives. And I put lizard with legged with an asterisk because one of the themes you're going to see here is that repeated evolution of limblessness is common in this group. And we're going to sort of try to embrace how and why that's come to be. And then a true limbless group, distinct from that, of course, and that being the snakes. Right? So these are the terrestrial, what I'll tell you in a second, overlapping scaled ectotherm reptiles that have vestiges of limbs, i.e. pelvic and pectoral girdles, but that have been reduced and lost to the point of being limbless. So we'll spend today talking quite a bit about kind of the diversity in natural history and taxonomy, and then we'll finish up next time kind of elaborating on more of kind of the ecology, behavior, reproduction, etc. of the 2 major groups, the lizards and the snake. But again, don't get too caught up in this lizard and snake designation. It is an old one, meaning more than 5 years ago, it was the way people operated. But we're going to think of this group now as really being 6 major lineages of squamates, which again are your lizards. Right. So this is again our second infra-class within the class Reptilia. So hopefully class Reptilia was represented under phylogeny. Class time. Look that way on my slide. So you guys can see that mostly in class Lepidosauromorpha. And again, it's in Blackboard as a PDF or PowerPoint, however you want to download it. Right? 7,700, low estimate, 8,000, high estimate brackets are species diversity within the lineage. So it's large. Right? Turns out the second largest of all our reptilian groups. The birds are going to be the most diverse in species number, most specios, in having 9,800 to 10,000 current species. Okay? This lineage, again, is going to be characterized by several key synapomorphies. The first of which is that they are not just scaled, like turtles, like crocs, like birds, like dinosaurs, but they have overlapping scales. And you can see that somewhat well on the small image of the underside of a forelimb of one of our squamate lizards, where very different from our archosaurs or archosauromorphins, which are going to be unveiled to you in a second here as the sister clade to the lepidosauromorphins. Archosaurs are dinosaurs, crocodiles, alligators, and birds. They have non-overlapping scales. So they started overlapping. You might imagine, again, functional, structure-function kind of relationship perspective, that the need to seal oneself from water loss as you move away from water is great. And one way to ensure that, just like you're building tiles on a roof, you overlap them, increase water impermeability. It's going to get better later, and we're going to see non-overlapping, impermeable exterior skin scale morphology. But again, not till we leap to our archosaurs. Right? Now there are some exceptions. Water snakes have reduced scales, and so when you get to 8,000 species, you see from instructors and scientists like me is that we are obsessed often with patterns, but we also are just as interested in exceptions because sometimes they prove rules. And in this case, it's an ecological phenomenon. When you live in water, you need to be as impermeable to water as you do when you're an ectotherm away from water and need to preserve it. Right? So you would have predicted, if there was a group that would show a relaxed constraint on overlapping scales, for it to be one that lives in water, unlike the ones that are so intent, right, evolutionarily, on retaining water with their overlapping scales. One neat phenomenon, again, it's not really a synapomorphy in the sense of sort of section it off here, but that snakes in several groups that we'll cover do in fact lose limbs. So the limbed tetrapod condition is the synclesiomorphy, right? But that several groups are going to repeatedly show convergent evolutionarily loss of limbs, and that's going to tell us something about, again, their locomotory style, their diet, their niche, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that moving forward. But please recognize from the outset that when you hear about loss of limbs in squamates, it is not just a snake phenomenon. Snakes may be a prototypical group for a variety of reasons, but I'm going to tell you there's at least 6 other losses of limbs independently throughout this lineage, and that's pretty remarkable when you start to look at the phylogeny and the sliders. Now, many tetrapod vertebrates, well, let me step back. When you learned about fish and amphibian reproduction in water, it really was about fluid, the fluidity in the environment. You have gametes, sperm and egg, that are requiring a moist environment, or you live in a moist environment. So you just kind of toss them out there in the world, sperm out, eggs out, and they swim and find themselves, everything works out fine in an external fertilizing situation. But hopefully, as we start to get more terrestrial, you see a pattern that, well, it's a little graphic, but, in a human situation, for copulation and fertilization, you couldn't imagine sperm on the ground, eggs on the ground, and they just kind of figure it out. In air and land, it ain't going to work. It needs moisture, i.e. internal fertilization results. Right? So that's my big picture view on ecology and evolution of internal fertilization, is you got to keep stuff moist. Right? So you see a lot of internal fertilization intramission in land vertebrates. Many animals will have intermittent organs, right? Penis in most familiar cases. But this group has a very different evolved male genitalia. And they're called hemipenes, which essentially, I thought I had this image of two, a pair there. Just time's wrong with the slide. But it's essentially this evertable paired organ, right, that intromits the female for insemination. Very different from the single intromittent organ, right? So the dudes have two of them, essentially, is what it boils down to, right? And that is a unique synapomorphic, shared, derived condition in this animal. Interesting, again, I could get into the hows and the whys and the effectiveness of having paired, but you can kind of relate it to maybe the dual system of egg production in females, where they've got pairs of gonads on opposite sides, right, for release. Now, so beyond reproduction, we see interesting sensory adaptations in this group. Something that's maybe a little more simplesiomorphic than anything, but that, did you guys cover, like in lamprey, this idea of a parietal eye, sort of a third eye on the head, for sensing light? Well, we see this in this group as well, which is an interesting carryover from ancestral groups. It's often thought to tune various rhythms, biorhythms, seasonal, daily, right? Sunrise, sunset, seasons change. So various fish have it, various amphibians have it, bullfrog, etc. And again, it's a common feature shared among Tuatara and then lizard and snake descendants. Right? So we call that the parietal eye. Now remember, this is a diapsid reptilian lineage, sauropsid lineage, right? So we're beyond the anapsids. We're going to spend a lot of time next time when talking about locomotion, feeding, and morphological adaptations, a ton about the skull and the jaw and what goes into what it is to be a lizard and snake in terms of the flexibility that diapsid condition affords them for feeding. So we're going to see many lineages with dislocatable jaws in ways that allow them a gait that consumes prey much larger than other groups, which some have argued is potentially the most critical focal adaptation for their success as a lineage today. Now, being small helps, right? Vast locomotory capability helps, but none of it could probably exist without that diet flexibility. It is a monophyletic group, so wild reptiles as a whole are paraphyletic. This does root with a common ancestor, okay? And that is again going to be the Tuatara and relatives, extinct relatives. And they are looked at as a sister lineage, as I told you, of the Archosaurus, which we'll cover probably starting maybe as early as next Thursday. And again, you've gotten some brief introductions to dinosaurs, but we'll again kind of quickly tidy them up as we cover their relatives. First, the crocs, alligators, and then the birds. So the higher order taxonomy goes something like this. Right? There are two major orders. The Rhynchocephalians are a monofamily order with a monotypic genus and species. So there is one species from one genus in one family of this one order. I.e. there's two orders within the group. Right? So I show you the only representative left of the Rhynchocephalians, Rhyncho meaning nose, cephalia meaning head. So there's something interesting about the head and nose of these creatures that we'll cover. Right? Sphenodontidae, something about teeth related to the nose and head that we'll cover here in a bit. That gives you some indications through their Greek-Latin taxonomic name as to what their key adaptations are. Anyone ever seen a tuatara? They're native New Zealand creatures and virtually wiped out from the mainland and exist in small populations in surrounding islands because European ancestors, humans, introduced mammals, and mammals wiped out essentially all mainland tuatara. So only those islands that have been predator mammal-free have retained tuatara. So they're very much threatened in that sense. And again, this is the ancient lineage, so you should recognize, limb is the root, okay? And, this was a very, prolific lineage. Probably early Triassic, kind of early reptilian era, 240, 230 million years ago, are some of the earliest fossils that, again, root closely to this, contemporary species. Admittedly, hundreds of millions of years since, so there's been some significant change, but it is a member of the Rhynchocephalian, the first lepidosaur fossil. So if I told you there's 7,700, 8,000 species in this lineage, and one of them is in one order, one family, then all of the rest, right, 99.9999% of the species are within this successful major division, the contemporary squamates, right, which again, I'm going to characterize for you as lizards and snakes. I put that in quotes because, again, that's a catch-all for a good number of the species, but there's going to be some other things in there now that, well, we're going to probably come up with names that make them either legless lizards or worm lizards or glass lizards or alligator lizards or legless lizards, but they're not your typical lizard, all of them, right? You watch a video at some point that gives you sort of the weirdest lizards out there in the world, give you a sense for some of the taxonomic and morphological and life history diversity in the group. You got some swimmers, some runners on water, some burrowers, several legless lineages, many tree dwellers, fruit eaters, insect eaters, egg eaters, right? An extraordinary diversity within this group. Right? So I'll refer to them by common name as the squamates. And what characterizes this group as a unique lineage is that they consistently show what we call caudal or tail autotomy. Anyone know what this is? Go ahead.
Oh, just removal of their tail.
Yeah, so they shed their tail, lose their tail, drop their tail, can regrow their tail, and it's often thought of as a predator defense mechanism. We'll elaborate on all the ways that animals do this in this lineage. Again, dominantly thought of among the lizards and relatives, geckos, whiptails, skinks, anoles, chameleon, et cetera. And you'll see some variation in extensiveness of how much of the tail they lose, and how the tail loss breaks, how it behaves when it breaks. So there's actually interesting studies in the evolution of the behavior of the tail and the tail loss. Right? So it says something important about the evolution of the tail in the group, in the sense that they're willing to lose it for the sake of the success of the rest of the body, the sensory organs, the head, the nervous system. If you grow another tail, I can't regrow another nervous system, another head, another CNS, right? I will repeatedly refer to the interesting multiple origins of and loss of limbs in this group. I'll point each of them out on the phylogeny to come here after I get through the Tuataras, and you'll really sort of recognize how, consistently reoccupation of the underland, if you will, i.e., where animals like their relatives came from, as largely slithering, eel-like, snake-like movers, can be effective in certain habitats and substrates, sand, burrowing, moist substrate, even again being effective in some cases swimming. So, your typical lizard, upright, limbed, fast runner, very much similar in its limb body design to running mammals. They can run very fast and very well. And the key feature, of course, is the positioning of the limbs beneath the trunk, coupled with what we call limb-trunk independence, i.e., when I move my arms, I don't have to move my chest. Other animals are constrained and move slower, but when you can release that constraint, you get animals that you and I can't catch by hand. We've got to use a noose or a net because they're just so quick in their locomotor capabilities. Right? An example of loss of limbs, again, would be one of these legless lizards, and then again, I'm showing you snakes here as a prototypical example of limb loss. Now, this group as a whole is small and ectothermic. In cold climates, they're going to get quick you're going to get cold quick. You may freeze quick. You're not going to thrive as well. So you don't see extraordinary lizard and snake diversity at the poles, but then, of course, as you get closer to the the equator and tropics, you start to see animals that can stay warm, stay active, move, feed, continue that cycle. Right. So tropical and terrestrial, with, again, a new niche being exploited, not just burrowing, which, of course, some turtles, tortoises didn't do, but in ascending, right? So terrestriality to arboreality, inhabiting trees and running up trees, running down trees, running up and down branches, on leaves, right? Small, agile, and a series of coadal adaptations, including things we'll learn about in the toe pads and gripping capabilities in things like geckos that can scale windows, which, of course, again, the vast majority of animals in history didn't evolve with windows, right? But slippery, leaf-like surfaces can be gripped by animals like this in ways, again, extraordinary and unique compared to their ancestors. So what I'm going to do is I'll give you the story on our quick story on our Rhynchocephalian species, and then spend the rest of the time on responding. There's not great natural history information on tuataras. If you just do a search yourself, try to find some nice, David Attenborough videos or some analog National Geographic, etc. You struggle to find a good, all-encompassing natural history account of this group. And it speaks to, again, how difficult they've been to study and how isolated they are. I've been in New Zealand and spent 5 months there. We saw them at Aquaria Zoo, Wildlife Park, but, I would have had to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars to get someone to basically charter a boat to take me to one of these rare islands to see these animals in nature. I did that for the native bird kiwi because I wanted to see birds because I studied birds, but I didn't happen to get the fortune to take my tuatara trip. But tuatara is an interesting root name. It comes from the Maori, right, the native people of New Zealand, and essentially means spines on the back, which again should give you some indication early on of a certain trait of interest, especially in communication and aggression, and that's something that can carry over into other lineages. Maybe iguanas are probably a good example of that to those of you familiar with them. So there is a video here. It's not great. It's a bit of a kind of spoken version of the natural history of the animal, but it's at least a supplement that you can watch depending on time. So again, this was the STEM group, and a group that was successful throughout much of the Mesozoic, right, early Triassic fossils, through the Jurassic, into the Cretaceous, really got cut back hard, I think, as a larger lineage of reptiles at that KT boundary, much like many large things did. And so we're left, we were left with largely smaller versions of Lepidosaurs after that KT extinction event. And, only so many have survived since, including these 2 subspecies here. Right? So there were a lot of them, and they varied in habitat, diet type, distribution on Earth. Right? What they have and share with the one species we have left today are, again, Spinodontidae, something unique about tooth evolution. We know many groups that you covered already. They'll shed their teeth, regrow their teeth. Right? Deciduousness is an early evolved trait among vertebrates in teeth form. We, of course, have it. Many of our relatives and ancestors have it. This group, however, has a very fixed, fused form of tooth called the acrodont teeth. And they're essentially a part of the bone in the jaw. Right? So you all know from dentist trips and dental studies to the role of the gums and roots. These animals just bone to bone, right? Acrodont teeth fused right into that jawbone. So it makes them at risk for obviously tooth breakage, but also somewhat limits their dietary flexibility, being so rigid in form, bone, jaw to tooth. Right, and that is going to distinguish them from often the loss of teeth in many of our other lepidosaurs, i.e. squamates, or be completely different from, say, you know, the envenomating structures, right, of fangs in highly derived situations like our venomous neighbors. So again, in 2008 and earlier, this was a bitypic, two-species genus. So Sphenodon punctatus and Sphenodon guntheri, the northern tuatara and the Brothers Island tuatara, I think they were called. I think they're still called that, but by DNA comparisons, they've shown that they are indistinguishable at the species level, interbreedable, even though they don't coexist, and so they're now given subspecies designation. I don't usually ask you to remember species or even genera. Right, my kind of rule is I want you to learn families and above. Okay, but in cases where there's just one or two, I'm going to list it just for the sake of completeness, so that you can familiarize yourself. That these are So this is northern, and this is Brothers Island, subspecies of tuatara from New Zealand. Again, they exist on about 30 islands. I think there was a recent case. One animal was seen to have hatched eggs on the mainland in hundreds of years, again, since European colonization. But aside from that one random, unique event, these are exclusively island dwellers off the coast of mainland New Zealand. And as you see with this one subspecies, the North Brothers Island tuatara, there's only a few hundred individuals left, again, on a 1-point-some hectare land mass. So, considerable threat, again, to the existence, long-term existence of these creatures, which is why there's been breeding programs and conservation efforts, mammal predator collection and eradication efforts to sustain this. In some ways, this is kind of an icon, and a proud, symbol of New Zealand wildlife and history. They've lost, as you know, many, many, many species, birds included, moas, things that were taller than us over time, and the things they can eat as their own and protected. They certainly put a lot of time and effort into it. So, they're a few feet in length on average, some smaller, some larger. And what's neat about them is they do have nocturnal habits. Okay, so they aren't the prototypical lizard in its diurnal, day-active nature. They're kind of funny in that you would think, again, as an ectothermal creature, they would bask and be active thereafter by sun exposure, and then shut down and be inactive in nocturnal times. But in fact, they are sun bathers and sleepers by day. And then climates aren't harsh, meaning they're not found in far southerly stretches of New Zealand, but mostly northern island and surrounding island in distribution. So they retain heat and stay somewhat active at night. But again, these aren't sprinters, fast movers. These are still kind of plotters with D's, not T's. They eat sort of slow-moving things that they can sneak up on often as they're nocturnally active. So, you might get your occasional small vertebrate, often, though, reliant on, small invertebrates, insects, spiders, and a bunch of the relatives, even crustaceans and things that live coastline. Now, they burrow, and that's going to be a very common feature among a lot of our groups, including some limbed representatives, okay? And, the means by which you can obviously stay safe, by which you can, regulate. A series of, again, things will play out that you understand how valuable it is to the lives of a lot of these groups, sit and wait predators, etc. But what's neat about them is they don't necessarily burrow exclusively for themselves. They actually have a rotational shared burrow with seabirds. So occupation of night burrows by sleeping birds then are replaced by day. Tuatara sleeping on, in the mouth of their burrow, right? So it's kind of, there's cohabitation. It's just you get to rent my apartment for the night, and then you trade with me for the day. What's funny is that sometimes at dusk and dawn, you're not really sure what you get. So a colleague of mine, was told, put your hand in this burrow, you might be able to pull out a tuatara, and instead it was some seabird that attacked his hand. Evil field trip.
Where does the digging go?
I think they both play a role, as far as I understand. Yeah, I mean, bird beak is only so effective. These things use limbs and can burrow maybe a little deeper. Yeah, so it's co-construction, cohabitation. And then what's also neat about them is that they have a series of means of communication that are visual in some instances, and that you wouldn't necessarily suspect it for a nocturnally active, moonlight only light environment. So they will vocalize, and there will be some other groups that vocalize in this lineage as well. It's not a very common thing, though, obviously. This group, we're going to get to some other animals, birds mostly, and then even some mammals, of course, that elaborate more on vocal communication. But they'll exhibit kind of some of the things we saw in the previous group, some head bobbing, head displays, erecting their crest and spines, maybe even some subtle color changes that indicate motivation or intent for competition and fight over burrows or nearby resources, and or prospective mates. So it's rudimentary, but it's present. It kickstarts this Lepidosauria lineage in a way that we're going to see, especially among lizards and their relatives, really proliferates in ways that include anole dewlaps, chameleon color change, and even gecko crazy colors and patterns, also for a dominantly nocturnally active lineage. So that, one species, but it's a major lineage, so it felt like we need attention to it at some level. But once we understand where we start, right, let's move to the 99.99% of all the other variations within the group. Right, so I'm going to start with, and again, I don't love doing this all the time, but it's been so instructive for me to learn about Lepidosauria and squamate evolution that I felt like I'd at least show you one big phylogeny. And it's a 5-year-old phylogeny that, again, revolutionized our general understanding for higher order taxonomic classification within the squamates. Right? So you look up there and you're like, oh my God, please tell me I don't have to learn all those names. And you're welcome. You do not have to learn the vast majority of those names. But what I'm going to highlight for you are the 6 main infraorders of squamates, sort of from the start, and then we're going to fill in the details in the slides to follow. All right? So some of you may not even be able to read that very well up there. I'd encourage you to try to drag it, blow it up on the slide, print it out, make sure you can clearly see it, and then we'll begin. So, these slides, I guess, are behaving odd in how they're organized. But at the very top, first branch, not surprisingly, away from the squamates, are the sphenodontids. We just covered the Rhynchocephalian tuatara. So that's way up there. Okay, you can't see it very well, but it's not a squamate. We move on past it. The rest, which you can obviously still not see 4 or 5 up here, are all squamates. Okay, and again, if you want to read the actual paper, the phylogeny, you can link to it here, Pyron et al. From 2013. These are essentially the table of larger or higher order taxonomic groups. But if you're clever, you notice there aren't 6 of them, there's more. And so there's some artificial groups that kind of capture adaptations more than relationships. So I'm not going to necessarily have you memorize all 8 of those. 6 of them are taxonomic groups. 2 of them are artificial. I'm going to have you ignore one of the artificial ones and get familiar with the 7th or the 8th one, which turns out is interesting from a venomous perspective because it captures all the venomous creatures. So I felt compelled to at least make sure you got some exposure to them. All right, so the remaining 8. Now I'll tell you quickly. C and E are artificial groups. We're not going to learn them as the infraorder. The remaining names are the infraorder. Okay, so let's march through.
Are those technically squamates then?
These are all squamates, correct? Right. So there we go. 6 squamate infraorders. I separate off the blind lizard because again I'm frustrated that you can't see the very top. But if you trust me, if you can see it somehow in notes are printed, there is one unique divergent branch early in the tree of squamates that shows you a group called the Dibamidae, which are blind lizards, which I I wouldn't have shown you, except it's an early indication that loss of limblessness happened right away, and that set this group off down a path for, one might surmise, susceptibility to limblessness or limb loss. Right? These often are going to share very convergent features, right? Not just loss of limbs, right? But annuli, rings around the body that help for telescopic locomotion, which actually they share in common with caecilians, which are covered back in amphibians. Right? They're going to be colored similar. There's going to be yellow, pink, purple, blue form, which still people are trying to understand why these animals, with more or less being blind themselves and being burrowing in most cases, would be colored in these ways. But, yes, ma'am.
Oh, it says that there's 6 spawning infraorders, but the list there has more than 6 things. Are those not the spawning infraorders?
Correct. So as I said, C and E are going to be your artificial groups that do not represent infraorders. A, B, D, F, G, and H are, I'm about to unveil each of them as the 6 infraorders. So we march down. The geckos, thankfully named Geckoda, so that you don't have to stretch your mind too much to understand who this representative group refers to. Right? These are going to be largely your nocturnal, but colorful, eyelidless, eye-licking early branch off of the squammy tree. Right? Again, I'm going to walk you through each of the sort of natural history peculiarities in a second. I'm trying to give you just some brief foreshadowing and highlights. Some of you will be familiar with many of these groups. Some groups may not be as familiar, and I'll tell you maybe a little bit more about those. So you can see here again that clade A represents about 7 families of geckos and relatives, right, at the top of the tree there. The next major group are the skinks and relatives. Again, if you look at clade B, it comprises everything in this clade. So 4 families of, again, largely running, diversely colored, in some cases even burrowing for safety, land lizards. Now remember, I do this now, whereas 2012 and before, this was just a simple lizards with their roots and snakes with their roots. So those of you who are anxious to get ahead, snakes are H. Big group, way at the bottom, and then look at how we've diversified in taxonomy, really, of lizards. Okay? So geckos, skinks. Lasortoidea, right? So the skinsoidea, or skinkoidea, it's got skink in there for you. Right? So the geckoda, geckos, skinkoidea, skinks. Lacertoidea are the lacertids, which, if you know anything about the families of reptiles, you would come to know them as the whiptails. There are also members of the wall lizards, tegus or tegus, and amphisbaenids, which also was a very unique clade that we covered when we covered lizards, snakes, and amphisbaenids as major divisions previously. Amphisbaenids are also known as worm lizards, right? And they look a little bit like this again, because there's several convergent features about this group. So clade D, again, comprises this lineage here. Okay? Again, I'm not having you learn all the intricacies of everything in this phylogeny. Just trying to paint a mental picture for you and then give you the details down here. All right, so the Amphisbaenidae is a unique family of new limb loss. Okay? Again, weird color, loss of eyes, loss of limbs, burrowing, fossorial, digging, ramming with their head, limited diet, limited gait. Again, I'll fill in some of those details here. Clade E we're going to skip because it's an artificial designation. F are the anglomorphins. Infraorder Anglomorpha is going to probably combine 2 of the most bizarre lineages that you wouldn't have naturally thought should be together. Okay? Anglomorphins are the first of the branch off within our venomous lineage. So there is a monophyletic venomous lineage of squamates. And it starts with some members of this group, again, not every one of them is, but the glass and legless lizards, which have an interesting loss of limbs yet again. I'll tell you why they're named glass lizards in a second. But they share a common ancestry with the biggest land limb squamates. Komodo dragon, varanid monitor lizards, Gila monster. I don't create this stuff. Scientists don't create this stuff. These are the data, right? By modern molecular phylogenetic tools. These are their common ancestry, right? So we'll cover, the groups as kind of a weird, again, F is here, so Varanidae, Helodermatidae, with the weird glass lizards and relatives nested in them. So it's not just like you have one branch to the crazy big venomous legged lizards, and then the limbless ones. The limbless ones are within the two branches, which again is it's bizarre. It's not what many hypothesized. It's not what the literature portrayed before 2013. But the best current total evidence we have. Last two are pretty easy. Your classic lizards, anoles, norops, chameleon, iguana fits into the iguania, right? A fifth infraorder. And it's a fairly decently sized group here, comprised of clade G. So you've got all of these interesting lizards, as well as your gametes and your chameleon, right, which I show here. Hopefully these arrows and pictures have been helpful to you as we've marched along. I realize I didn't show one of our big varanids here, but I promise some of you know what a Gila monster looks like. Some of you know what a Komodo dragon looks like. I'll show you more photos in a second. All right, so that's a very successful, large, probably the most successful lineage within lizards is found in this clade. And then, of course, our last of our 6 infraorders are the snakes. Right? Snakes get a lot of attention because of, again, their membership in Toxicophora, or Toxicophera, depending on where you put the accent. But this is, again, a portion of the lineage of squamates that's within this artificial venomous group. That, again, includes everything right from your garter snakes all the way up to anaconda and several of your fanged rattlesnakes and all those things. Right? Sea snakes included. And so that's your squamate family tree. Right? And now let's meet the family members. Oh, sorry, one more thing. So that venomous clade, E, right, which includes a link to some of your varanids, some of your venomous lizards, and then, again, not every one is venomous. That's not what I'm saying. But what they wanted to represent in this tree was that of those members of squamates that are venomous, they all share a common ancestor. Okay. Understood? Just because you're in Toxicophora doesn't mean you are venomous. But to be venomous means you're in Toxicophora. And again, it's not an infraorder. That's why I put it in green, and why I show you here, again, the fellow that got left out, one of your large varanids. All right. Well, let's meet the players here. First, let me just step back and give you a little bit more detail on what unifies this group a little more. Right, again, very successful lineage, squamates, vast majority of the species within the Lepidosauria clade. They are unique in sharing the skin shedding trait, right? Otherwise known as ecdysis, right? A lot of animals, insects included, will shed their skin, invertebrates, crustaceans. So this isn't necessarily a novel trait in animal evolution, but it's not something that we saw so uniquely, right, in fish, in amphibians, when's the last time you found a shed turtle shell skin, right? A shed turtle skin. Doesn't happen, right? So this is new. It's something that's fundamental to their need to retain moisture. You can't carry around that skin and have it degrade as it wears due to sun exposure, abrasion, wind, just denaturation of proteins and heat, etc. You gotta replace it. So animals will, rather than like birds, which sort of drop feathers in various regions, that they're not afforded that regional capability of having external dead tissue in cups and areas. They surround themselves with it, so they drop it. And this is where you find snake skins or lizard skins, or pets in your yard in the desert, etc. So that's a neat kind of unifying feature. And then again, what really defines their capabilities and success, in my view, ecologically, is the mobility of the jaw. The presence of collapsible and flexible quadrate bones, which again I will show you images of next time, show you how they've moved in the jaw over space and time and evolution, are underlying, in many ways, the progressive success from rigid anapsid through rigid early diapsid tuatara, through even semi-flexible, but now, plastic, if you will, lizards to the truly dislocatable jaws of some snakes. All right, so we'll spend time on that in our next meeting. It is not that common among the groups, but it's worth noting that this fundamental idea of determinate growth appears within the squamate. Everything we've talked about to this point in this class continuously grows throughout life, i.e. indeterminate growth. There's no determination. Continually cell-proliferation at the ends of bones, adding tissue, growth. These animals, and again, not all of them, but some of them, show evidence that they have an endpoint to growth and shift their then allocations physiologically to reproduction. Not too unfamiliar to us. I mean, this is what we do, right? Grow till we're 20, and then, obviously spend 50, 30 some years, plus or minus, of course, with exclusive investment in reproduction. Gonads, gametes, grandchildren. So how they do it is through a tinkering of the cell plate system at the ends of bones, whereby the cells at the zones of growth in the epiphyses, again I'll show you images next time, do not extend because they are capped by the epiphyseal plate that does not allow for additional adding of cells to the tissue. It's essentially a zone of activity that's capped. Now, they share this in common with us, they share it in common with birds and other mammals, but it's not always the case in Archosaurus. And it's very much not mostly the case in this lineage. Okay? So, once again, don't get the impression that I'm saying this is a synapomorphy transcendent across squamates. I'm saying this is the first existence of it among few representatives within this lineage. Okay? I'll talk about who those are as we move forward. But what people have surmised, how does this work evolutionarily? What underlies whether you continue to grow or grow and then reproduce? Well, a lot of it comes through the energy sort of cycle, input and influx and efflux of food and energy. And in animals that tend to have, sort of a prey base that's consistent, that they can access and consume, right? Keep growing, keep eating, keep moving, keep reproducing, you just keep it going, right? But when you get to think of a group like snakes, right, which might eat once a month in some cases or less frequently, you've got a clear limitation on prey consistency and intake. So evolution has not necessarily favored you to keep doing everything because of this potential threat for long periods of energy, and limitations for energy in. And this is going to be seen again as we move on towards top predators, animals that have inconsistently available prey bases, tend to compartmentalize, grow, and you start breeding a little bit, and then stop growing, and the rest is reproduction. Okay? So prey, availability and consistency of prey is largely thought to be a macroevolutionary driver for when determinate growth evolves. It's not regularly available, not going to consistently grow. Right, and then just a kind of brief reflection on the fossil record. Again, I told you a little bit about early Mesozoic and times of success for rhynchocephalians. You know, they dominate a good portion of Lepidosaur evolution in the Mesozoic, but that sometime around the late Jurassic, you started to see the foothold that squamates took, and that many of our generalized larger forms of squamates showed evidence of their existence by that late Jurassic into the kind of the era of the dinosaurs. Now, dinosaurs, of course, dominated the macro, the large megafauna of reptiles, but Tuatara's relatives, small lizards and snake groups, dominated in the later part of the Mesozoic as the small creatures. All right, so let's march through here. And again, I'm going to take about a minute or two for each of these groups. But the geckos, right? Show you a few images of geckos here, right? Key large and all-encompassing adaptations include nocturnality, right? So there's about 1,500 gecko species worldwide. They are the smallest representatives of the squamates. So the smallest of any squamate you find would be a member in this group of the gecko, okay, in size. To be small means to be able to get cold very fast. So you got to live, especially in warm and tropical climates, right? And often in moist climates, right? So these are moisture craving. They don't live super well in the desert unless they're finding lots of water or burrowing. Definitely live around humans because we supplement, of course, in the desert and city with water. But what's interesting is because of their moisture needs and reliance over evolutionary time, they have not evolved eyelids. Now, why do you have eyes? You blink, you keep your eyes moist. Same phenomenon across the scale, right, across the vertebrate groups. So to lack them means you better live in moist places that keep your eyes moist. Or again, if you don't, you got to find ways alternatively. And that's why you show an image here, see an image here of an animal licking its eye. This is actually a not that uncommon means generally across the gecko species by which they can behaviorally ensure moisture of their internal tissue, right? Yeah. Eye adaptations are really diverse in this group, again, because of their nocturnal tendencies, right? They actually see color well, and it's because they evolved from day-active groups, and it's actually a really cool story. So those day-active groups, it looks like, had mutations and alterations to their rods. You guys know rods are the sort of the night light dark sensors, as opposed to the cones, which are the good color sensors, right? So if you evolve from a group that had poor rods, and you're going to be nocturnal, well, you can't rely on exaggerated rods. They've actually exaggerated their cones in ways that help them both capture light and see color at night, which is a very, very, audapomorphic, unique feature of life for this group. So because of that ancestry, they can be colored. They also communicate with sounds, which again is pretty unique among squamates. And again, to be living in moist places means living on slippery things often. And so they have among the best sort of digit adaptations for grasping slippery things. So they've got lamellae on their toe pads, which are these little individualized cups and rings that allow them to just stick to stuff. And if you don't believe me, my colleague at the University of Massachusetts has created his own company. Sorry, that's right. Manufacturing something called Gek Skin, which is essentially a human industrially produced biomimetic substance that grips things like gecko skin does. And it's used in all sorts of ways. Just be creative in ways you think you want to have stuff to stick, whether it be for medical purposes, for industrial purposes, for military purposes. Remarkable biomimicry, right? We've used how nature solved a problem and manufactured a way to do things with it. To kill geckos and get their skin to do it, you just make it. So pretty phenomenal adaptation in geckos. Right? So there's 6 of these groups here. Let me keep marching through. Skincoidea, again, depending on who pronouncing it. I promise it's in green at the top. Infraorder Skinkoidea. Right? I show you some representatives here. Blue-tongued skink, maybe familiar to some of you. Right? These are often either drab, running, squatty-limbed lizards, or they can potentially be colorful in ways that often are at the tail. And again, we're going to return to that in a second here when we understand what they're doing with their life history. Right? So a lot of species, successful lineage. Right? They're interesting in their necklaceness, maybe shared in common with things prior. We're only going to see interesting neck evolution when we get to, well, maybe snakes, but also birds, mammals, things that get upright, mobile, and that neck becomes important for breathing, for seeing, moving their head in interesting ways. But they are stumpy, short-legged, so they kind of amble in awkward ways. Some have even evolved limblessness again. Right, so they've got that kind of anguilliform, large body, locomotion style like an eel, sort of swaying back and forth sinusoidally, right? And in many ways like snakes, but again, convergent as a lineage to their form of locomotion. And this is true whether they're limbless or whether they're limbed. Right? Think of them as kind of slithering lizards. Right? They will commonly dig and burrow, which you might have predicted, based on their ability to slither through some firm surfaces like sand, soil, and moist substrate. But they tend to be more day active and insectivorous, which is a fairly common thing for small active creatures. You can chase small active prey, i.e. flying things, insects. Right? Many other things are too big, not rewarding enough to eat small insects, or don't move enough to catch those things. So the evolution of this lineage actually tracks in some way the species diversity of flying insect diversity in time because of the prey-predator pressures as they chase each other away, literally and evolutionarily. So you got some cryptic forms, some colorful forms. People often ask me, what about that blue-tongued skink? What the heck is that? I didn't know the answer because I didn't study it, but a colleague did some work in 2015 on this. And it's not that conclusive. It's the first test of its kind. But it remarkably resembles the colors of a lot of the outsides of skinks. But if a lot of animals use the tail of the skink, in ways to attract the predator and say, hey, attack me here, I stand out, and then they drop their tail and the predator eats the tail, and then the animal laughs and runs away, safety, right? You wouldn't want to do that with your tongue, right? You want to attack it with your tongue. So it's not thought to play a predator deterrence role or a predator luring role, but instead be a signal to potential partners and competitors in kind of a mating or resource competition context. And it's neat. What's neat about it is it's coverable, right? This tail you're carrying around, you can't hide it. Many animals will have hideable traits, things like in the mouth or cover your feathers with something. And that is, only need to use it. Only show it when you need to use it. Open your mouth. It's a specific context. You don't need to necessarily flip that tongue out unless you want to show off. The Lacertordia, right? And this is again the whiptails and relatives. You see some of the groups, not as species diverse, about 500 species, right? Includes wall lizards, tegus, right? And this weird worm lizard group, the amphibians. Right, so you've got, again, several limbed groups, and then some limbless representatives. Common. Right, tropical in distribution, nothing necessarily new about that. But they do live in a diversity of terrestrial habitats, including burrows, and then, of course, even into trees and branches. Right? Again, insectivorous. But there are some larger wall lizards that can be predatory. Thus, they kind of get bigger, bulkier, thicker. That's fairly common for larger top predators. The bigger you are, the bigger the prey you need to consume. Right? Others, like whiptails, have the really long whip-like tail that they can use as a distractant while moving. They also have weird forms of breeding. Several groups actually are parthenogenetic. You guys have heard this probably before, as they don't need the males to reproduce. Females just produce clones. Right? We'll cover that next time when we think about the evolution and reproduction. Right? And again, the amphibians are just a weird group. They burrow. They live in moist, kind of swampy, terrestrial, but humid habitats. They've got secondarily reduced skulls, right? All these things are secondarily evolved limbs, secondarily evolved reduced skulls from a very flexible skull ancestor. And they ram through substrate. That's how they dig, right? They've got basically battering rams as heads, and they push soil and sand out of the way. And then, they're limited in their gait because of their need for a rigid head skull. And so they don't really have the diet flexibility that other groups do. So they'll eat small, soft, larvae of insects, invertebrates, earthworms, very different than in their life history. The anglomorphs, again, are a bizarre, what I call kind of bipolar group, right? In that they've got the dominance of legged venomous forms interrupted in the middle by these different forms of legless lizards. There's glass lizards, alligator lizards, some called legless lizards, all of which, again, have very reduced, if not absent, limbs. Right? Not a lot of these species in general, so it's a kind of a underrepresented group taxonomically. But some of them have some very weird adaptations that make them, kind of lizard-like. They've got eyelids that they can open and close, unlike geckos, unlike snakes. They've got external ear openings, which is again a diagnostic feature of several of the groups. The small versions, of course, consume small prey, but then, of course, you've got Gila monster, piranid, Komodo dragon, monitors. They obviously are top predators. Some of them are egg eaters, i.e. ovivores, you see here at the bottom, egg consumers. Right? It's kind of an easy thing for a big thing to stumble upon, is a nest full of eggs to consume. But the glass lizards get their name because when their tail breaks off, it breaks into kind of pieces that all kind of still have nervous system activity and vibrate. So it's like a meal full of worms that a predator is excited about to consume. And again, meanwhile, the fully intact adult animal runs away or slithers. Sort of finish briefly here with our iguanids, right? Again, all sorts of varieties. These two groups are among our most species diverse. We've got a couple thousand species, roughly, of each of these last two groups. The iguanians, right? Chameleons, anoles, horn-collared lizards, right? What unifies them? They're generally small, generally cryptic, brown or green. Again, by being arboreal, you may want to match green backgrounds, but they've got some really unique adaptations that allow them to thrive in these circumstances. Chameleons are color changers. They've got a prehensile tail that they can hang from trees from. They've also got these weird toes that allow them to grasp branches exceptionally well as they kind of walk slowly out along the branches. They're all very good at color vision and motion detection, which you need, again, for exceptional feeding on insects and locating shadows and moving things from a distance. You even got these crazy things, right, where you can projectile tongue and catch flying insects outside of your body, which is really a unique feature. But there are some herbivores, i.e. things that will consume plants, and those tend to be the big versions, right, big iguanas. Marine iguanas are weird, right, in the Galapagos, consuming algae on the inner side of it. Right, and then finally snakes. Snakes, again, I don't have to get into too much detail on these groups because they're a little more familiar to you, right? But you've got small versions, large versions, ambling, sidewinders. You've got sit and wait predators, some with rattle, some with venom. The most speciose lineage within the squamates, right? And again, big variation in size. Some, again, burrow. Some are blind. Some can climb trees. Right? Some even swim in marine aquatic habitats. Right? They do vary in how they move and how they slither. We're going to cover that next time. There's a good foreshadowing. And then again, we'll talk about sensation in the world. They've got this vomeronasal organ, vomeronasal organ, that allows them to chemically sense and even heat sense in some cases their prey while they hunt. So extreme adaptations for hunting. We'll talk about live bearing versus egg laying next time. But I want to give you some clickers at the end here, so let's take a minute. We're right up against it, but I started a few minutes late. So, look at channel 41. Just two questions again. Doing nice. So. rather than getting too ugly. Right? Again, no need to talk, just look and grab a few notes if you'd like. So the ancient condition for skull temporal fenestration in this lineage of Lepidosaurs is, are we talking about anapsid, diapsid, synapsid, or sauropsid? Right? Ancient condition for their skull. And again, I'm not talking eye orbital, I'm talking muscle attachment. Anapsid, diapsid, synapsid, sauropsid. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, we had a little trouble with this one, but the majority win. Okay. Remember, sauropsid is not a temporal fenestration skull hole characterization. It's a characterization. So that's stumbled there. That's okay. You got another question coming here, and how many major evolutionary transitions to limblessness occurred in this vomit? I covered this exclusively. I tried to drive it home a few times. Was it 1 transition, 3, 5, or 7? So there's the first slide, showed the phylogeny on the fourth slide. 1, 3, 5, or 7? 5, 1, 3, 4, and 7. Next point.
It's really impressive.
And we will again dive a little deeper into